We are back with another episode of App Stories. This is episode 273, sponsored this week by SourceGraph and Instabug. Federico Vitici, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm looking out on a very gray, rainy spring day here in the Chicago area. It's cold and rainy. I don't know about how it is in Rome, but I'm sure it's better.
I'm looking at a really nice blue sky.
Of course. That's Rome. That's Rome for you at this time of year. All right. Well, let's dive in today because we have WWDC just around the corner. We are 4 weeks out from WWDC, and last year we did a series of wishes episodes all about the various OSs that'll get updated this year. And we're going to do the same thing again this year. We're going to start today with iOS 16 and our wishes, kind of going back and forth between the two of us. I guess it's the flattest round robin you've ever seen, but since there's only two of us, that's the way it's got to be.
Yes. So we organize these wishes in system features and system apps and different categories of stuff we would like to see. I think I would like to start from the home screen. And we're going to go quickly here because I think we have a lot of wishes to cover.
We do.
Plus, we're doing episodes for iPadOS, macOS, tvOS, and watchOS. We're going to have some special guests even. But we're going to go quickly and we're going to share a ton of things we'd like to see. Obviously, we're not going to get them all. But hey, that's why we do the wishes, because these are wishes, not predictions. So, the home screen. So I really feel like Apple should go back to work to improving the system that they introduced in iOS 14 with widgets on the home screen. We didn't see any changes on this front in iOS 15. That may be due to how Apple plans major features in advance for the next software update. There was this discussion on our Discord couple of months ago, I think, where essentially the theory is when iOS 14 was about to come out in September 2020, Apple had already finalized the list of features of iOS 15 sometime in August 2020. Therefore, they had no way at the time to know that widgets in 14 were going to be a massive success. And that's why in 15, we didn't see any obvious follow-ups to those features. But now it's been another year, and I really think it's time for Apple to iterate on iOS 14 widgets. So I'm going to go ahead and say I would love to see interactive widgets on the home screen. Now, obviously, interactive widgets is something that Android has had for a while, right? The idea that you can have widgets that have multiple interactive elements. The obvious example that comes to mind is a Now Playing widget, where you have playback controls directly on the home screen. Even Apple Music has one of these widgets on Android, but they do not have this kind of widget on iOS because the technology doesn't let them do it. So I would love to see a new version of WidgetKit with support for interactive widgets. Now, interactive widgets could have multiple buttons. I wouldn't expect to have a keyboard input on the home screen, although I wouldn't be totally opposed to it.
I wouldn't
right?
either.
Imagine like a note-taking widget that you can tap and you can save something quickly from the home screen. Like a notes widget that lets you capture a thought from the home screen. Or maybe there's a microphone button that you tap and you can dictate a note from the home screen without having to launch the full app. But I would expect multiple buttons. I would expect, maybe different types of input like keyboard and microphone. But I also would expect for apps to be able to show you UI elements on the home screen. Now, in theory, this sounds complex, but I have two very practical examples for you. Two apps that use private APIs, that have been using private APIs since iOS 14. Shortcuts and, of all system apps, contacts. I remember mentioning contacts in my iOS 14 review. The contacts widget for iOS 14 and iOS 15 shows you a grid of profile pictures for your favorite contacts. If you tap on one of those pictures, you're not taken into the Contacts app. You see a pop-up on the home screen with the contact card for the selected contact. I think, and obviously with shortcuts, you have the shortcuts widget, you tap on a shortcut and you see, I don't know, a list, an alert, keyboard input, whatever, on the home screen. I expect these APIs to become available to developers so that you can show, I don't know, a document, or you can let the users choose from a list, but basically show interface elements on the home screen.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think I'd love to see this kind of thing in an RSS client too, where you could, right? You'd see a list of articles, and maybe you're in a hurry and you don't want to open up your RSS client. You can save it for later. Star it, save it, whatever it happens to be. That would be really nice.
Yeah, that would be excellent. While we're on the topic of widgets, I also wanted to mention, I think it'd be great to have more widget sizes.
Oh, sure.
And just
Absolutely.
more general freedom when it comes to placing widgets. There are still some pretty heavy restrictions on the kind of layout that you can have on the iPhone home screen, especially in terms of how many icons can be placed next to a small widget, for example. So I would like to have more grid freedom if possible, but also, and perhaps even more so, more types of widget layouts. I would love to have like a mini rectangular widget that is the size of two icons next to each other. I honestly would love to have a extra small widget that is just the size of an icon. And maybe you could use that for complication style visual updates.
Sure.
Like imagine an extra small widget that is just an icon of a bottle of water, and a water intake tracking app fills that icon through the course of the day as you drink water. Like those types of visual updates, I think would be great in a very small widget. And obviously more shapes. I'm not expecting triangular widget or widgets or circular widgets, but I don't know, maybe like a tall rectangle, different on iPad, different sizes of different, like an L-shaped widget would be fun to have on the iPad.
That would be interesting.
So I don't know. Yeah, that'd be interesting. So more sizes and more freedom for placing those widgets next to icons.
Yeah, I like that idea, especially of the small widget that has an icon that shows some sort of information. I could see that being really great for things like timers too, right? You could see how much time is left on your timer. And the vertical widgets to me are perfect for anything that has a list that's not like a lot of text, right? Maybe it's the days of the week and the temperatures, your forecast, you're up for the next several days, that sort of thing would be great. We should talk too, Federico, I think about, I guess, two things. One is information density, and I don't want to dwell on this too long because we've talked about it a lot. But for instance, the shortcuts widgets could really stand a redesign where you could fit on more shortcuts. And that's more particular, I guess, to that widget because some developers have found ways to do more information density in their widgets, which I appreciate. But I also want to mention the lock screen because it's related, I think, to widgets. I think widgets on the lock screen could be a great thing. I know you've talked about that in the past as well. But I also want something maybe a little different than just widgets on the lock screen. I want information on the lock screen from third-party developers. And the thing that made me think about this recently was I had a timer going on my phone, and I was walking around the house, and I wanted to check if it was still running. And I thought, boy, wouldn't it be easy if I just could lift my phone and see that the timer is going and not have to unlock my phone and then go from there. And it's little things like that I think could go a long way to making the iPhone easier to use.
Yeah, I would love to have more, again, this is right on, in line with the idea of allow for more customization, right? After iOS 14, you didn't really do anything in 15 to build on top of that customization potential from the year before. So now it's time to do it again in 16. And the same, what I said for the home screen, the same is true for the lock screen. I would love to have, if not just widgets on the lock screen, some type of complication on the lock screen. I think it's great that you can have the flashlight and the camera toggles, but I would love to have more buttons in there, or I would love to just decide what goes in there. The same like, Now Playing and the clock, they have lock screen privileges in that if audio is playing on your device, you get the Now Playing is it a widget? I don't know. It's a control system on the lock screen.
It looks a lot like a widget. I mean, I think it's a close cousin of a widget, I guess.
And if you have a timer running, of course, you get the timer on the lock screen.
Right.
If you have an alarm, obviously the alarm takes over the lock screen when you're waking up in the morning.
That's exactly what I was thinking about when I ran into this with Timery. I thought, boy, wouldn't it be nice if Timery could put that same kind of thing there, like the timer.
Exactly. So I would love to have. I'm not sure if Apple wants to go the route of just put widgets on the lock screen, because that's where that will require a major re-architecture of just from a layout perspective of where notifications live. Because if you put widgets on the lock screen, well, then how do you access your previous notifications, right? Because on the lock screen, you can now swipe up and you see your missed notifications. I do think it's confusing right now, and this maybe takes us into the next topic. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention on the home screen, this could even be true on the lock screen, I would love to pin folders and files.
Oh, sure. That would be nice, yeah.
Kind of like a desktop. Anyway, I do think it's confusing that at the moment on iOS, you have both Notification Center and swiping up on the lock screen, right? You can open Notification Center while you're inside apps by swiping from the top, right? But if you're on the lock screen, you got to swipe from the bottom. And this difference has always confused me. So maybe there is room for Apple to say, you know what, you can now get to your notifications just by swiping from the top. But if you're on the lock screen, now we're going to use the bottom space as a widget area on the lock screen, and we're going to move a few things around, and we're going to give you both notifications and widgets on the lock screen.
That is an interesting idea. I'll tell you, I really don't use the notification center or the swipe up feature on the lock screen at all, hardly ever. I mean, whatever is the recent ones are already there on the lock screen, and I don't bother to look at I never swipe up to see what's below those. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by SourceGraph. So you've hired a brilliant developer. That's great, but now you have to get them onboarded. If your company is growing, onboarding new developers will be a common occurrence, but it's a big undertaking every single time. One of the biggest challenges for new hires is to get up to speed on the projects that their team is working on. This can be tricky if the code bases that your developers are working in are already large. Thankfully, SourceGraph makes it easy to move fast, even in those big code bases. Developers know that knowledge is most useful when it's findable. Centralization is helpful, but given the fact that most companies store knowledge in at least 2 different locations, how do you make knowledge accessible to those that need it? As a code intelligence platform, SourceGraph gives developers what they need to drive their own learning over time and in different situations. Teams without SourceGraph need to rely on asking colleagues or reviewing out-of-date documentation, which is cumbersome and time-consuming. But with SourceGraph, every developer can search across millions of repositories to find specific code, saving time for themselves and everyone else. So, when questions do come up, you know that it's the big stuff that's worthy of extra time. SourceGraph was created to make developers' lives easier, and today they work with leading companies across every industry, including 3 out of 5 of the top tech companies, including PayPal, Uber, Plaid, GE, Reddit, and Atlassian. Visit about.sourcegraph.com to learn more. That's about.sourcegraph.com to find out why some of the biggest tech companies in the world use SourceGraph and to see what it can do for yours. Or just click on the link in the show notes to let them know that you heard about them from us. Our thanks to SourceGraph for their support of the show. You know what? Before we get to apps, Federico, I think we ought to stick with a couple of system things. And
I want to talk about notifications.
Okay. let's see. I guess we can I'm trying to think of the order to do these things. So I also want to talk about the Today view and the app library. But I guess we should start with notifications because that's kind of a big topic.
Yes.
And I'm really not sure. I'm not really sure what Apple can do to fix this because I think it's a complicated problem because you have notifications of varying priority and importance that are very much based on an individual's personal needs and preferences. And you've got notifications that come in at all times of day, all the time. And I just don't feel like they've nailed this yet. And it needs to be rethought, maybe completely from the ground up.
I agree. So I think it's a really hard challenge, right? Because also there's all kinds of apps that try to work around any limitation that Apple puts on notifications. So I think,
Right.
Was it last year? I think it was last year when they introduced the regular notifications and the time-sensitive notifications.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, we've seen examples of apps that were asking for time-sensitive notification privileges, and they didn't really need them. You don't really need to be time-sensitive if you're a game or, an entertainment app. Your notifications do not need to be time-sensitive. But I also think Apple is thinking about this problem, and they haven't really nailed it yet. They've tried last year with another, I would say, failed feature because I don't really see it as having any kind of impact on regular users that do not read or listen to tech podcasts or blogs. The notification summary. That's a feature that they introduced last year. And the idea was, well, what if you could categorize your notifications and schedule this summary to group these notifications in bundles throughout the day. But the thing is, you got to create those summaries manually. So that's kind of like focus modes. You're putting a ton of friction on this feature already because you're asking people to do the work up front. And then the initial design of the summary was very boring. It was just like a notification that you needed to expand.
Yeah, it was like a stack
in notification
kind of,
It was like a stack. They made it better in 15.2 or 3, I believe. And now the summary as is like dynamic grid view with the icons of the apps that sent you notifications in the summary. And that's a bit better. But you still got to do the work up front. Now, the answer could be, well, create a dynamic system that arranges notifications for you automatically. And I think that's a direction that I would like to see Apple explore. So, for example, the issue, right, is that you're asking people to do a ton of work up front and set up these summaries. You're giving them tools to say, when you get a notification, quickly let me mark this notification as a summary notification, right? Because you can open a notification in 15 and say, send to notification summary instead. So that future alerts from that app will be sent to the summary. But that's nearly not granular enough. And it still requires a manual action from the user. So I think Apple could do what Google tried to do years ago with Android, and they could probably do a better job. Use categories of apps. You could use the default categories of apps, the same ones that you see in the app library, maybe. And you could say, okay, all gaming-related notifications, schedule them at 9 p.m. in the evening, because that's when I'm relaxing. Or some of these notifications from these specific apps I want to see right away. But basically, give me a way to say, automatically triage these notifications for me based on which type of app they come from. Or if I really want to take control of this, let me choose where they should go. I think the category approach is something that could save users a ton of time, and you could be proactive, right? And say, okay, the system is going to suggest that you enable this notification summary because we see that you have 5 different news apps installed. And you could do things like the system is going to create a summary for you at, 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. every day with these news apps. And you don't need to do anything. You just need to click accept. But if you want, you can then go in and manually set them up. I feel like the category-based approach could save users some time, but also help people, create this system where you don't feel like you open Notification Center and you just see a long list of random, uncategorized alerts, because that's not fun.
Yeah, I like that idea. I also think if they were to go down that path, that that Apple should find a way to set these up in the moment, so that when you get your New York Times alert,
Yes,
right, it says this is a New York Times alert. Do you want to look at it now, or do you want to categorize it and deliver it at a specific time, along with these other apps, and maybe suggest the apps there, CNN or the Washington Post, and get someone to set it up in the moment? Because one of the problems with this sort of thing is when you install an app for the first time and it asks you if you want to allow notifications or not, you don't necessarily know. You don't know if that's an app that you're just going to use for a week and discard and go back to something else. You don't really know exactly the extent to which it's going to send you notifications, whether it's going to be like every half hour or once a day. It's a little hard to know up front exactly how you want those notifications delivered. But once they're coming in and you see what the information is, what the context is, how frequent they are, and how they relate to other apps in your life, then it's a lot easier, I think, to decide that. And there's a little bit of this kind of baked in now, but I think if it were to be combined with the category approach that you suggested, it would be great, because then you would, not only would you be dealing with the New York Times notification, but at the same time you could get rid of, or, just deal with in time and schedule all these other notifications from similar types of apps.
Yeah. And also I would like to see another idea that is not related to managing notifications, but it could help, is using notifications as automation triggers in shortcuts. We're going to talk more about shortcuts in the next episode of this wishlist series leading into WWDC. But I think the idea of, I get a notification from Twitter that's a trigger for shortcuts, that's also an interesting idea.
Yep.
And you could potentially do things like, if I get this notification that is of this kind, right? Because you could also have this kind of filters, like, is this a DM notification, or is this like a timeline notification? If I get a notification of this kind, mark the notification as read and do this instead.
Right.
I think there's some interesting potential there. Now, I want to talk about multitasking next, but I just want to say a couple of things that I think we forgot to mention regarding the home screen. The first one is, I would love, and you mentioned this in your macOS review last year, John, I would love to be able to resize widgets without having to remove and reinstall the widget.
Yes.
macOS Monterey lets you do this. You just right-click on a widget and you say small, medium, large,
Yep.
and you just resize the widget in place. This is not possible on iOS. I wish it was possible.
One of the few things that I think that the Mac gets better on widgets than iOS, because widgets on macOS, we'll get to that when we get to macOS, but I don't use them much on the Mac. I do on the home screen too, Federico. I want to mention wiggle mode, because moving around icons, especially now that we have widgets, is so hard on an iPhone. It's hard on an iPad too, but wiggle mode has to be rethought and fixed, because it's just too hard to place widgets or app icons right now.
Yeah, I agree. Now, before we get into apps, multitasking on iOS, so on the iPhone. So I want to see QuickNote on the iPhone. For more on QuickNote, I talked about it, and some problems that I have with it in the pre-show for App Stories Plus members. So appstories.plus is where you want to go if you want to read more and sign up for App Stories Plus, which is a longer ad-free version of App Stories that has extra content, no ads, and comes out a day before. So you can, if you want to listen on Sunday when it usually comes out, you can get it 24 hours before. Anyway, so QuickNote on the iPhone, I think it should happen this year. I don't see why, we have picture-in-picture on iOS now. Mm-hmm. I don't see why the QuickNote floating element shouldn't also be available there. And it would be a small floating pop-up, then of course becomes bigger and becomes, like I imagine, this full screen sort of square-shaped capturing box with a keyboard underneath it. And I think it would make total sense to have it on the iPhone. Like I can imagine it already.
Do you think that the iPhone Mini is the thing that kept that off of the iPhone? And with if the iPhone Mini going away, that Apple might be more willing to add it,
Probably, but also like whatever. Like if you get a small phone, you got
to deal with it.
You got to deal with it. Like that's your problem, not mine. Why should you penalize? Why should you punish users who get bigger phones because of the minority that has a smaller phone? So, and also it would still work, right?
Oh, sure. It'd just be a very small window.
It would be small, but it would work. Now, I want to see what you think about this. I think it is time for Apple to try and see if split view could be possible on the iPhone. Using two apps at the same time, one at the top, one at the bottom, or if you're using your iPhone in landscape mode, side by side.
Yeah.
And I mentioned this because I've tried split view on Android, and I think it's totally doable on a phone now, especially if you have a big phone like the Pro Max.
Right. It wouldn't work well for all types of apps, but I think that there is something to it. Just the idea of having a note-taking app in one pane and Safari in the other would go a long way, because you could drag in URLs or bits of text and images and things like that. And yes, on the bigger phones, but I think even on the standard size phones, there's enough room there to. I mean, it's not perfect. You're not going to do this and make this your main workflow. You'd want to be on an iPad or a Mac or something to do it for any period of time. But if you're out and about and you're looking at a web page and you're like, oh, I just want to quickly drag some of this information over into this node that I've got already, that would be perfect. I would love that.
I think people would lose it for this feature. Like, just imagine telling them you can now use WhatsApp and Netflix at the same time.
Yeah.
Or you can do WhatsApp and, I don't know, play a game at the same time.
Yeah, messaging's a great example. Any kind of messaging.
But I also think, or you could have two different conversations, one in WhatsApp or two WhatsApp windows or two iMessage windows open at the same time on your phone.
That's a recipe for people sending the wrong messages to the wrong groups, though. I can tell you that
right
now.
But also, I really feel like people would just love it.
Yeah, they would. They would.
And I think it's time. And if you do that, well, that would also mean, well, are you bringing the multi-window system from iPadOS to iOS? And my answer would be yes, you are. You're bringing the same system there. So you could have multiple instances of the same app open. And I actually think that more people will use multi-window on the iPhone than on the iPad. Because so many people have an iPhone and are doing more things at once on an iPhone than an iPad, I think.
Yeah, I feel like this is a feture that maybe would have to be limited to the Pro model phones, because it's going to require more memory, right? I mean, that's one of the things.
And it would also be a way for Apple to make more money, because you could say, hey, here's this feature that is technically for pros, but that a bunch of millions of regular people would also want, even if they do not consider themselves pros.
Yep, it's the upsell.
But pro doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just the upsell for the more expensive phone that does more things. So I think if you're bringing multi-window to iOS, right, that also means you should probably rethink how you're displaying open apps and windows in the app switcher. Now, obviously, you have the horizontally scrollable carousel of windows, but I don't know, maybe you should have something more like an iPad, or maybe, like the tab view in Safari on the iPhone, where you have a grid view instead of just one list of open apps and windows. But if you're enabling iPhone users to do multitasking and multiple windows, maybe it's also time to rethink the app switcher and give them a little more tools to manage their open apps and windows. So that's all. And also, potentially, if you're bringing multi-window to iOS, you could maybe create another path for developers of Catalyst apps. because you could say if you have done the work on your iPhone app to support multi-window and split view, well, guess what? You can also bring your iPhone app to the Mac now, not just an iPad app to the Mac.
That's interesting. I mean, you can already bring iPhone apps to the Mac, to at least to the M1 Macs, but it might make it easier for people to do that. I don't know. It's an interesting thought. I think that they could probably use the same sort of little pill-shaped button at the top of the screen that they use on the iPad for the iPhone. I don't know why that wouldn't work. Might actually make more sense on the smaller, more cramped screen where you're, kind of pushing that window off to the side while you find your second app to create your pairs. I don't use that a lot on the iPad, to be honest, but I think on the phone it would, with the more limited space, it might even make more sense right there.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I could see that. I mean, I think it's a good idea. I'd love to be able to do more with my phone. I feel like the iPhone hasn't had like a productivity kind of boost system at a system level in quite a while.
Exactly. All right. Should we talk about some system apps?
We should. I want to start with Files, Federico, because speaking of productivity, this is the app where that really pales in comparison to the Mac, unfortunately. Still, I mean, it's made a lot of improvements. There's been, Files has gotten better over the last couple of years. However, there's the long lost feature of pinned folders, which I thought was a great idea, and it was in like 2 betas 2 years ago, and then disappeared and never came back. And maybe it's just been hard to implement, but it's the kind of feature that just makes it easier to find things. So I'd love to see it come back. And then, of course, you and I have talked endlessly about smart folders of all kinds and all sorts of apps. And Apple has started to go down this road, at least with things like reminders in particular and notes to a degree. I'd love to see smart folders based on search criteria baked into the Files app that you could then save in the sidebar and get back to really easily. The place where I think the Files app pales in comparison to the Mac the most, though, is in the metadata that you can search, that you can sort and filter on. The Finder is fantastic that way. Whether it's date modified, date created, date added, file type, size, all sorts of different columns that can be added to that Finder window and then sorted by. It's just not something you can do in Files. You can do date-based sorting and you can do name-based sorting, but that's about it. I mean, it really needs to be expanded for it to be a really good productivity tool. And I guess the last thing I would mention is that the state needs to be saved between times you go into Files. You see, that it's a little hard to describe, I suppose, but you always get reset back to the beginning of a list, which doesn't happen on the Mac, right? You navigate around from folder to folder and you go back and you're where you were when you were last there, which is great because it creates this contextual experience where you really have a sense of place and what you're looking at. With Files, I always feel like I'm reset to the top of a list and now I'm scrolling back through. And if you have what it does is it makes it very difficult to use a complex folder structure. You really need to have a relatively short list to make it easy to navigate through Files, whereas in the Finder, combined with the search functionality, it's very easy to move around, even if you've got hundreds of folders and lots of files in each of those. Yeah.
And I would also add on Files, quick actions, right? Something that you can do in the Finder. You can have quick actions from third-party apps. You can have your shortcuts as quick actions. That's not possible on iOS or iPadOS. And I think the Files app should also support quick actions because why not? It should be the same as Finder.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Instabug. Building mobile apps presents some challenges. Bugs, crashes, and performance issues can be a nightmare for developers. But what if I told you that you could not only detect those issues, but you could also get a holistic understanding of the quality of your app from your user's point of view? Instabug's lightweight SDK grabs all the insights that you need to build top-quality apps through comprehensive bug and crash reports, performance monitoring, and real-time user feedback, all in just one SDK. With Instabug, you can continuously monitor and measure the performance of your app as perceived by your users. Empower your users to report issues and ask questions seamlessly from right inside your app. Get all of the information you need about bugs, crashes, and other issues, and get them fixed in record time, all with a focus on privacy and security. And you don't need to worry about the hassle of switching to a new tool. It only takes a minute to integrate Instabug into your app, and it fits right in with your current workflow, with support for Jira, Slack, Trello, GitHub, Zendesk, and over 10 other popular tools. Join over 25,000 top mobile developers around the world who use Instabug to ship high-quality apps. Go to try.instabug.com/appstories to check it out today. Again, that's try.instabug.com/appstories. Our thanks to Instabug for their support of the show.
I want to talk about two apps that don't exist. So I'm kind of cheating here. The first one is very easy. I mentioned this before. Keychain. The Keychain
yes.
should be a standalone app. Apple has built a de facto password manager now. It supports recommendations, obviously randomly generated passwords, one-time authentication codes. It supports, it's got warnings for reused passwords, passwords that have appeared in data breaches. It's a really great, powerful password manager that integrates with Touch ID, with Face ID, with third-party apps, with Safari. But it's buried in settings.
Yeah. And Federico, since we're in charge here, obviously, let's not call it Keychain. Let's just call it Passwords. I think we should change it on the Mac too, because Keychain, I get it. I know what that is, but not everybody does. And it doesn't necessarily make as much sense to other users. So I think Passwords would be a better name.
Just call it Passwords and make it a standalone app. And the second one is Reading List. Now, I know this is one of my things, right? It's one of the things that I mentioned. It's like it's the new shelf. But Reading List, I continue to firmly believe that it's such an underrated feature that Apple has seemingly forgotten about.
It is, but it's so limited in so many ways. That's the problem,
it's
right?
It's so limited, and it's such a wasted opportunity. I mean, anything would work here, right? In terms of like just acknowledge that you're still aware of its existence. That would be a nice first step. Honestly, I think we should be glad that they didn't remove Reading List with the Safari redesign last year. I mean, at least they found a place for it. So, hey, thumbs up, great sign. But, anything would work here. Highlighting, right? Save highlights. Search. Let me search my reading list. Let me tag my reading list, maybe.
Folders.
Let me have some folders or some shortcut actions, and I really think make it a standalone app. I mean, you've done apps for less important things, you've done Measure and you've done Compass and you've done Clips. At this point, just, everybody uses Safari. It could be a standalone app. And if you don't want to make it a standalone app, fine. But at least let users have some more functionalities. Otherwise, why just keep it there?
Yeah.
Reading List at the moment, the only thing it can do is it's its own section of Safari, and it can save articles offline by default.
Well,
is that really all there is? Like, otherwise, it's just a glorified bookmarking system.
Right. And that offline feature hasn't always worked particularly well.
And it exactly. And it doesn't always work.
Right.
So show some love for Safari Reading List. You have plenty of so-called low-hanging fruit to pick here. I mean, literally anything would work.
One thing that still concerns me about Reading List is that you've got, at least on the Mac, the sidebar, it's in its own little group with bookmarks called Collected Links. And the UI is just weird in that with tab groups, you've got
I never noticed the name Collected
Yes.
Links. That's such a bad name.
It's terrible.
What?
But if you look at the tab groups, you've got a little disclosure arrow, right? So you can collapse it, and it's like there's folders underneath the tab groups for each of your groups. Whereas when you go down to Collected Links and you click on one of these, it completely replaces the UI. It's very tacked on. Is what I guess I'm saying. It's not really a consistent user experience between bookmarks and Reading List at the bottom and the tab groups up at the top.
Yeah, that's rough. What do you wanna talk about now? What's in your list for apps, John? Let me see.
modernizing mail, Federico.
Yeah, I know you were going to pick that one. Okay.
I like the Mail app a lot in a lot of ways. I think it's a fairly solid app, except that it's just behind the times. And there are features missing that I really want and kind of need. I mean, one of them is the lack of shortcuts integration. By that, I mean meaningful shortcuts integration. I know that I can create a mail message in shortcuts, but there's not a lot else that you can do with them. And things like deep links, which you can kind of create, there are ways to create them on the Mac. Can't do it on iOS. And even on the Mac, it's clunky and not easy to do. I want smart folders. I want snoozing of email. Now, I'm not a big email snoozer, but I do feel like that is a feature that is kind of table stakes at this point for a lot of mail clients and that people actually do use it. I'd like the ability to kind of convert an email message into a task and put it in reminders. It would be something where it could maybe take the subject, or maybe it could take whatever is selected and turn that into the body of the task, and then link the mail message in the notes field so that you can get back to it easily. There's a lot of things that can be done with mail, and Apple obviously is focused on mail from a privacy standpoint with some of the things, like Private Relay that have been introduced, but the app itself has barely been touched in a while. And, we've got these extensions that came out on the Mac last year that there are very few of them. I have not really seen more than a couple that have come out, and I'm not sure why that is, but I'd like to see that come to iOS as well and come in a way that actually is then utilized by developers. Maybe that's part of the problem. I don't know what the deal is, why those extensions don't exist. Maybe people aren't making them because they only work on the Mac, and you can't have them on iOS as well, where more users are available. But who knows? Those are at least some of the things I'd like to add.
Yeah. Music.
Yes, music. A good one.
Music. Okay, so music. So one thing that I feel like I should mention, because it's such a weird thing, crossfade.
Yeah.
The music app on iOS does not have crossfade. Apple Music on Android has crossfade. I really don't know. It's such a small thing, but I thought I would mention it.
Right.
On to a more serious wish. I really dislike the performance of the music app.
It's very slow.
It's so slow compared to Spotify. Spotify, it's just blazing fast. The home page of Spotify loads super quickly. Search is instant. As you type, it's incredible. The search of Spotify is incredible. Of course, it doesn't help that I fundamentally dislike what Spotify has become now as a company, but I gotta hand it to them from a performance standpoint. It really is incredible. And Apple Music is just so slow.
Shouldn't at least that start page load in the background or something? Maybe it turns over at midnight or whatever it happens to be, whenever it updates.
I don't know. But they gotta do something, right? The Listen Now page is slow. The Browse page is slow. Search is so slow compared to Spotify. Just make it faster should be imperative for the music team this year. But also, I continue to believe, I wrote this in my review 2 years ago, I still think it, I don't like the Listen Now page. I feel like the information density is all wrong, and I feel like when I open Spotify, I get more value out of the home page of Spotify than the Listen Now page of Apple Music. I think Apple is on the right track in terms of offering a mix of suggestions and your recent activity and other recommendations, but the density is way off. And again, the performance doesn't help. I think from a design perspective, they should rethink it a little. Show me more stuff, right? While also being faster. Right. And on that topic, I also think Spotify does a much, much better job at giving you a full-on listening activity page where you can see every single thing you ever listened to in the past few months. I believe it's limited to the past 3 months, but essentially you have it looks like a time machine icon in Spotify, and you click it and you get a list of every single song, album, playlist, everything you listen to. And you can go back and play it again. And we should have the same thing in Apple Music, right? It should be a private thing where we can go in and see everything we've streamed in chronological order. That's one of my favorite features from Spotify. And honestly, I would be happy with performance improvements alone. But rethinking the design a little would also help.
Yeah, smart playlists is another thing that we've talked about for years,
obviously.
of course. But I don't know. I mean, I
kind of lost hope there.
I kind of have too, and I do. It's not like I'd make smart playlists a lot, but I do have a handful that I use pretty regularly, and would like to be able to, when an idea for a new one comes up, in my mind, to be able to just grab my phone and do that instead of having to wait till I get to my Mac. But that's something. I think that ship maybe has sailed at this point. Who knows?
Do you want to talk about notes?
Yeah, let's talk about notes. I mean, what do you think, Federico? What does notes need? I think.
Well, I said it before. I think Apple should acquire Craft.
Yeah.
But that's probably not going to happen. What I think they should do, though, is take a serious look at what Craft is doing and find a way to improve Notes without giving up on its elegant design and simplicity. But I think there's definitely ways for Apple to take a look at what the modern note-taking space is doing. And of all apps, I mean, obviously, Apple is not going to take a look at Obsidian. They're not going to do custom plugins for Notes. They're not going to do extensions for Notes. No. They're not going to do what Rome Research is doing. They're not going to do what some folks like Logsec, for example, what they're doing there. But Craft, I really feel, and I mean, they're giving it an Apple Design Award for a reason, right? So
Sure.
They are aware of Craft. But just to pick out a handful of features that Craft does really well and that Apple Notes should borrow, let's say, if not just Sherlock.
I think so. Yeah, I think the linking is the important thing.
Linking,
right?
Linking.
And maybe doing it in a graphical way that Craft does, where there's like pages that can be customized. That makes it a nice way to organize a document. I would hope that Apple doesn't pick up the block-based. Because I'm not really a huge fan of that. I think Craft does it better than any other app, but I would like it to remain just a text-based app, but with that kind of cross-note linking.
Exactly. I would love it for it to remain text-based. I also dislike the block approach in Craft and Notion. But I think you're looking at these two really popular note-taking apps, right? Craft and Notion. You cannot ignore. You gotta respect the fact that millions of people are using these apps, and they have certain expectations when it comes to linking to other notes within the note-taking app. So being able to easily refer to another note from your library, but also having much faster and visual in-app search. And this is something that Craft does really, really well, which is you click on, you type Command O for Command Open, and you have this visual like in-app spotlight, essentially, that lets you, it's not just search, it's like a command launcher. It lets you search notes, it lets you search titles, but also lets you search pages and sections. And it lets you jump to anything you want. And if you're Apple and you're looking at this, you must be thinking, why are we not doing this? Right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. The notion of leveraging Spotlight on a per app basis is really intriguing to me. I'd love to see that.
Rich links everywhere. I think it's wild that in 2022 you paste a link in Notes and it's a raw URL.
Yeah.
Why is that the case? I mean, even Obsidian has plugins now to turn URLs into rich links.
Yeah.
And it's so weird that Apple Notes does have support for rich links, but only if you capture them via QuickNote or the ShareSheet extension. Why?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. And lastly, rethink the shortcuts integration for Apple Notes. This is a bigger topic that we'll talk about in the next episode when we cover shortcuts alongside iPadOS. But these shortcuts actions for Notes are stuck to 5 years ago, 6 years ago.
It's a long time.
They're limited to plain text, and you cannot even pass an image to the shortcuts action for Notes.
Well, you can. You just get image underscore 56, right?
You get the file name of the image. So redo the entire shortcuts integration. Yeah. But yeah, more generally speaking, Apple has been doing some really good things with Notes, with the pencil integration, with the collaborative features from last year. I really like the activity sidebar that they did last year to see changes to a shared note. All good things, and the tagging, of course. But having this, people, I feel like they have certain expectations now from a modern note-taking app. And if you really had to pick out just two of them, I would say you got to be able to refer to other notes and link to other notes within your library, and you got to have faster search. And then there's a whole list of other things that would be nice to have. Markdown comes to mind. Yep. Having sub-pages within a note also comes to mind. And again, I don't think they're going to do custom plugins or extensions for your notes, although that'd be interesting, but I don't think they're going to do it. But still, at least a couple of these more modern features from your, this modern generation of, backlinking, that kind of stuff. I think they got to do it.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that would be fantastic. Federico, can I hit you with one last one before we go today?
And I also have one last one.
All right.
Go ahead.
Good. I want to go back and rewind to system items again and talk about the share sheet, because the share sheet is really showing its age. Every time a new beta comes out, the share sheet ends up kind of broken. And I think that's, who knows what's causing that, but I think it's the age of the share sheet, that the share sheet is doing a lot, especially if you have a lot of shortcuts or a lot of apps on your phone. It can really have performance issues. But the problems with the share sheet go far beyond performance. I think there's never been a good distinction between share extensions and action extensions. I know what I think they mean, but developers use them in different ways. And I think sometimes things that should be action extensions are made share extensions because share extensions get the colorful icon and the other action extensions get lost in the mix with the shortcuts and everything. But I don't know that the distinction is all that meaningful to people. And there can be apps that have what would qualify as both share extensions and action extensions for the same app, which can get confusing. I'd like to see it torn up and redone. I would like to see more color introduced for things that are now currently considered action extensions. I'd like to see more organizational tools like folders, perhaps, so that you wouldn't have to scroll through an incredibly long list. I think that there should be better separation between things that are app-based and things that are shortcuts-based, because it gets a little confusing in that long list too. I mean, I know the shortcuts ones come last, but something more than that I think needs to be done. And then I think, again, it comes down to performance too, that it needs to be reorganized, rethought, and streamlined so that it is easier to use than it currently is.
I agree with all of that. I agree. All right, my last one is reminders. There's many things I would love to see in the Reminders app. Just this week, for example, I realized that while tagging autocompletes, so as you're adding a reminder to reminders and you start typing the name of a tag, that tag autocompletes. You get the suggestion in the both on the Mac and iOS. Right. But lists do not autocomplete. So it's almost like you're being punished for using lists instead of tags. I would love to see more views. I think it'd be interesting to see reminders get like a board view or a calendar view, maybe for your scheduled reminders. But anyway, I understand that Apple wants to keep things simple. And if that's the case, I'm fine with Apple keeping things simple in the Reminders app, but at least give third-party developers a modern Reminders API to craft more advanced and custom reminders experiences. For example, currently, developers, if they want to create a third-party reminders client, they do not get access to subtasks, tags, rich links, and attachments, let alone collaborative lists or assigning reminders to a specific person via iCloud sharing. But these 4 major new features of reminders, subtasks, tags, and rich links and attachments, are not available to third-party developers at all. That's why third-party clients like GoodTask need to roll their own solution for this, which is incompatible with reminders. Meaning, if you create a tag or a subtask or attach a PDF document to a reminder in GoodTask, it doesn't show up in reminders because it's using a proprietary feature,
Right.
given the absence of a real reminders API made by Apple that supports all these modern functionalities. So I'm fine with Apple keeping reminders from a visual perspective and from a functional perspective as simple as it can be. But at the very least, let developers build on top of it by offering a modern API for it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic suggestion. I'd love to see that as well. All right, Federico, that's it for this week. I want to thank our two sponsors for this episode. That's SourceGraph and Instabug. We offer an extended version of this show called App Stories Plus every single week with bonus content. And this week, we talked a little bit about QuickNote. Federico had some ideas about how QuickNote...
I had thoughts.
He had many thoughts about QuickNote and the iPhone and highlighting and things like that. So if you want to hear that, you can subscribe to App Stories Plus. It also comes out a day early on Sundays. And it's in high bitrate audio, which is pretty awesome too. So it sounds really good. Just go to appstories.plus to check that out and get all the other details as well. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.